hold on to your questions either in the chat or hold on to the end, that would be fantastic. Again, I have everybody muted for now. We will get to the point of asking everybody's questions, and then we will unmute you so you can answer any questions that Pierre has for you. And as soon as Pierre, are you ready to go?
I am.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to make Pierre the spotlight, and we are ready to go when you are.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So this is going to be, just like we did a buyer's guide for the 123 and 107 series cars, this is going to be our MBCA Insiders buyer's guide for the 108 and 109 chassis cars. And so to help you guys understand better what models we're going to be covering, we're going to be looking at the 250S and SE, the 280S and SE and SEL, the 280 SE 3.5 sedan, and the 280 SE 4.5 sedan, as well as their long wheelbase versions. And that is the 108 series. And then with the 109 series, we're going to be looking at the 300 SEL with the M189 engine, the 300 SEL with the 2.8 liter M130 engine, the 300 SEL 3.5, 4.5, and the 6.3, which I think there are more than a few of you on here who want some information about the 6.3. So the primary reason that I felt a sense of urgency to do this buyer's guide is because I think we need a permanent record discussing the strengths and weaknesses of these cars in a more in-depth first-person encounter sort of point of view spotlight, so that more people who are shopping for these cars understand where the details on the cars are that can set you back thousands of dollars. I find that most sellers of these cars, whether they are dealers or private owners, do not have a comprehensive understanding of the car and its needs. And they will look at a car like a 280 SE sedan and say, oh, the car runs good, it stops, it brakes, you know, it doesn't have any major rust, the interior looks nice, the paint is presentable. And, you know, the car seems to present as a decent car, so therefore I can go out and price it at 20 grand, you know, and that's something that's becoming more and more common, especially in the overhyped bring a trailer market, which, you know, fortunately or unfortunately has, at least for the foreseeable future, altered the price of these cars dramatically. So in this Insider's Buyer's Guide, we're going to discuss not so much deal breakers, you know, basic stuff like how much rust the car should have, but we're going to look at nuanced items that can affect A, what you're going to pay for a car, and B, what you're going to spend to actually sort the car out going down the road. So the first category that I want to look at on the 108 and 109 series is the front subframe. Then we're going to go to rear axle. Then we're going to talk about air suspension, which is on the W109. And then we're going to talk about some of the interior details. We'll get into climate control systems such as HVAC and air conditioning, because those are all very important items that help one enjoy their car. And then we're going to talk about market values. So hopefully some of you will find some very useful information in this presentation. So the 108 and 109 have a front subframe that holds up the engine and transmission, and the front suspension bolts up to the subframe. So the subframe is a pretty important part. I would say that the front subframe is singularly the most important structural member of the car that can actually be removed. So if you have the unibody, which is just the body shell, you know, passenger compartment, engine compartment, trunk well, etc., with none of the fenders bolted on, you have this giant heavy metal bracket that's suspended between the left and the right front fender, and also suspended at the front of the car, just below where the radiator mounts and where the bumper mounts. So this subframe is key to the structural integrity of the car. Now, what a lot of people don't look at or discuss with the 108 and 109 are the front subframe mounts. These subframe mounts are mounted literally inboard of the shock absorber, inboard of the fender. They're mounted on like the inner fender, and I should probably, I don't know. Anne Marie, do you think you could Google a picture of 108 front subframe mounts and pull it up for us?
Sure.
By the way, I am so lucky to have Anne Marie because she's probably the only person that can like deal with like my ridiculous spur of the moment requests. So I really would not be able to do this so efficiently if it was not for her. So, you know, there are not very many Anne Maries in this world. Anyway, let me know when you find it. But these subframe mounts over the years, they have a metal mounting bracket with 4 bolts that suspends the subframe to the body. And then they have these 19 millimeter bolts that suspend the mount to the subframe. But of course, the core of the mount is rubber. You have a metal cone and metal mounting plate, then you have a rubber core, and then you have another metal member. And of course, the rubber disintegrates over time, causing the subframe to become, instead of one piece, 2 pieces. Now, when this happens, effectively what it means is that at its most critical mounting point, your front subframe is not connected to the body of the car anymore. And this is a really big problem because a lot of people don't check these both when they're buying and they're selling, and they're expensive to replace and they're a little tricky to replace. We'll touch on the subframe mounting procedure shortly, but in order to properly replace your front subframe mounts, I'm not talking about doing it, like a barbarian. You have to suspend the engine in the engine compartment and then drop the front subframe onto the ground so that you can not only change the subframe mounts. There we go. So that's the rubber part that disintegrates, leaving the inner metal cone and the outer metal cone completely detached from each other. And but anyway, you not only want to change these, but you want to do motor mounts. There are subframe mounts that are associated with the front sway bar at the very front of the car. These can't totally detach, but they're like a flimsy leaf spring. So you want to do those mounts as well. You want to do front shock absorbers. There's a stabilizer bar that connects the front subframe to the right side of the chassis. You want to at least do the bushings in that bar. And then while you're in there, you can do things like a steering coupler, or if you have a 6.3, the alternator mounting bushings. So my message here is that it's very important to check these front subframe mounts and see when they were replaced last, because, I would say like the bigger the rule too is the bigger the engine on the car, the shorter the subframe mount life. And if you're buying a 6.3 or a 4.5 or a 300 SEL 3.5, they're going to be much harder to replace, and there's going to be more work involved. And you have air suspension lines. The subframe mount. Oh, am I back yet, Anne-Marie? Just give me a thumbs up if I'm back. Okay, good. All right. Thank you. The subframe mount, if you have, it's 8 to 10 hours of work minimum. On a 6.3, it's more like 20 hours of work because you've got so much extra stuff to do when you're in there. Like, hey, why don't you pull the AC compressor and reseal that while the subframe is out? It's much easier. But you're going to pay $400 to $500 for a subframe kit from Mercedes. And if you use a Phoebe kit, and actually I have nothing bad to say about the Phoebe mounts themselves, FEBI as in Phoebe Bilstein. For under $200, you can buy a Phoebe kit and it will deliver what I think is reasonable service life. Some of the hardware in the kit is made in Asia, and that's usually the part that I discard, but the mount itself from them is made in Poland. And in some cases, it's actually the rubber in it is actually proven to be stronger than the Mercedes stuff. So I don't know, explain that to me. I'm still not sure why, but um, the the all the parts of this job could, set you back around, let's say around $850 or so. And, with labor, depending on what the shop you deal with is going to charge you, at minimum like 8 hours if you have a 250S and you really want to get the thing cleaned up. And then if you have suspension grease fittings that haven't been greased in a long time, and you have to go into suspension parts, you could add hours and parts on top of that. So when you're checking one of these cars out, it's a good idea to make sure that those subframe mounts are in good shape and you don't have any other major suspension issues. Now, we're going to go to the rear end of the car where we have the back axle, and the back axle has its own set of rubber mountings that are also often neglected. And the 108 and 109 series cars use a low pivot swing axle. What it means is that your right axle, or right axle tube rather, pivots, and then the left side is fully integrated into the differential. Now, connecting the pivoting right tube, which needs its own fluid supply, and the center differential, which is where all of the gears are and most of the fluid is kept, you need some kind of sealing measure to keep the fluid inside the differential, and it's moving from the right side to the left side and the left side to the right side. So Mercedes decided that they were going to make a boot, a rubber boot. And this rubber boot is a very tough part. We see and service a lot of these cars that have their boots that were installed in the 60s and 70s that still look good and are doing exactly what they're supposed to today in the present day, which is amazing. But still, on some cars, the boots are bad. They get gummy, or they start to leak, or they get ready to rip, or they get to be so bad they tear open at the top, particularly in cars from extremely dry climates. So, Anne-Marie, do you think we could pull up a photo of like maybe a 113 rear axle, because it's the same type of axle? This axle, by the way, was used on 108, 109, 111, 110, 113. Very similar to the axle in W120 and 121 series cars, W180 series cars. So this axle design was not a new design. In fact, it was on its way out because Mercedes felt that they could come up with a better suspension, which was phased in 1968 on the 114 and 115 series cars. But this suspension has proven to be incredibly tough and robust. And so we're going to talk about, oh, here we go. Okay, super. So you guys could sort of see the axle layout, and right there you could sort of see this boot. Now, I'm sure most of you are looking at this photo and you're wondering, how would we replace this boot if it is bad? And there are two options. There's the half-assed way to do it with a split boot, and then there's the right way to do it with a full boot. Now, people ask me, they go, but Pierre, when is it appropriate to use a split boot? And when is it appropriate to use a full boot? Well, it's appropriate to use a split boot if you're driving somewhere and your boot shits the bed, and ruptures and leaves oil all over the highway, and you've got to get a boot on there. That's what the split boot is for. It is for emergency repairs or situations where you don't have the time to pull the axle out and put a boot in. That's what it's for. The split boot, unless you're a real genius, is known to leak. It never seals 100% unless you use this amazing product that's very hard to get called Worth Bond and Seal. Yes, you can make a split boot work with bond and seal, and I've done it before, but the ideal way to do this repair is to pull the whole axle out and knock this giant pin out that holds the right supporting tube on and install a complete boot. And when you're in there, you might as well do axle bearings and upper and lower differential mounts and differential centering bushings and maybe rear shock absorbers, and you should change all your spring pads. And most 108s and 109s need all of that rubber stuff in the back. So at minimum, 85 to 90% of cars with this axle that we see have blown out, uh, upper diff mounts and lower diff mounts. And sometimes if the boot's still good, you can just change these two mounts and pull off the rear pinion seal plate and pull all the rear springs out, and you can sort of kind of leave the axle in the car, sort of, you know. I mean, it's not, it's pretty close to removing it. You know, you're almost like at that point where you're like, I might as well do this. But, you know, if you're trying to expedite things a little bit and you know that that boot's going to be good for 10 more years or something like that, and you have a lot of confidence in it, then you could just change these mounts. But of course, nobody changes these mounts. And that's what I find ironic. These $25,000, $30,000 280 SE 4.5s that are selling on BAT and in some other places usually have these worn out rear axle mounts. And it's starting to become very evident to me that most Mercedes shops don't even understand that this is a problem. You know, a good example of this is a friend of mine, when we were on our way to StarTech 2011 in Milwaukee, we drove up to we drove up there and the axle boot was leaking in his 280 SE 4.5. And of course, 2011, how old was I? It was 10 years ago. So I was like 26. I was not that well versed in these rear axles. And the car started leaking so much diff oil. We went to a well-known shop north of Madison that's not Black Forest, in case some of you are wondering, but this is another shop. And they put on a split boot, which was the right thing to do, but the owner of this car was complaining about excessive negative camber on the rear wheels, which is a good way to spot an extremely worn out diff mount. And what I have learned about these cars is that if you see a problem like that, there's usually an underlying cause of the worn out component. You shouldn't try to correct it by making up a repair. So this shop, as well known as they were, they decided to put literally air cells in the rear springs that were pressurized at 20 psi to keep the car up. Stupid. At the time, I didn't understand the problem, but years later, when I had a chance to service the car, I learned that the rear diff mounts were blown out. And I pulled the whole rear diff out. I put a continuous boot in. I put new rear diff mounts in. And I guess it was a fool me once, and both the shop owner and I, because I was responsible for serving this car, I had no idea what was wrong either. You know, I was no better than they were about diagnosing the problem. But you know, this just goes to show that even those of us that are continuously around the cars sometimes don't understand this issue. And so that's why when somebody says, oh, I have a great mechanic, you know, he said the rear axle mounts are fine. No, you need to inspect them yourself. And so what you're looking for is when you get under the car with the lower diff mount, there's this big triangular arm. If you pull up the picture of the diff again, Anne Marie, I'd like to point out where the lower diff mount is. So what you're going to see in the middle is this big triangular finger.
Pierre, you lost audio.
And what happens to the rubber? It squishes out. So if you see no rubber, if you see old rubber squishing out, if you see, if you grab the thing with like a pry bar and you see the inner tube moving and the outer tube staying in place, you know this mount is bad. But usually if you see rubber starting to squish out of it, it's collapsed. And you put 500 miles in that thing and start using the car regularly, diff mount's done. You know, A lot of people like to ask me what these parts cost. The upper diff mount is lists for $296. The lower mount lists for exactly $400. If you happen to be the owner of a W110 chassis, a 180 chassis, or one of those earlier cars, they have a much cheaper lower diff mount. It's like 100 and something bucks. But for a 108 and 109 car, it's $400. If you have an air suspension car, the upper diff mount lists for, I think, like 480. Wheel bearings are about 135 each. These cars use a special swivel race rear wheel bearing called a Tonenlager, or a barrel something. I don't know. It doesn't really make a lot of sense when you look at the German translation, but it means that the outer race of the bearing can move, meaning they're quite expensive to manufacture and they're not easy to install. And all of the 108 and 109 cars use Tonenlagers, or swivel race bearings, on the left and right axle tubes. So in the ends of those axle tubes, there are two wheel bearings with movable races because of the movement of the axle shafts. And there are some other things that you can get into, like 6.3s. There's an internal well, I should put it this way. The 108s have an internal U-joint inside that axle about where the boot is, and the 109s have an internal CV joint. And both of those assemblies, especially the CV joint, can get fractures in them from, years of being beat on by owners, particularly in 6.3 liter cars. So if you get a weird vibration back there that nobody could seem to diagnose, you might have to go into the rear axle to find the cracked CV housing, and that's what the right axle shaft fits into. Another thing that can happen is when they get super high mileage, the gear housing, where the spider gears that turn the axle shafts are located, the housing can get worn out where the gears are anchored into the housing, and so this can cause clung, clung, clung. You'll usually find this on cars where if you put the parking brake on and you put the car in neutral and you try to turn the drive shaft, you'll get 40 to 90 degrees of free drive shaft rotation, which is a lot of free drive shaft rotation. But we'll put it this way: on these axles, you're either going to have very little, like less than 5 degrees, or you're going to have a ton of it, like 50 degrees, 60 degrees. So you're either going to have very little, or you're going to have a lot of extra free rotation. That means that the diff has to come out, be opened up, and taken apart. I remember on one car in particular, before I understood this issue completely, because I'm young, I'm learning about these cars too. Every day I learn something new about them. I had a 280 SE shipped to my shop, and I missed this issue, and I had to fly up to Long Island with all my tools and pull the diff out of the back of the car and take the differential apart completely in the owner's garage and replace the center gear housing and put the diff back together. And that was probably the worst Labor Day weekend of my life. But I got it done. I mean, I didn't so much mind the job. It was more the fact that I was thinking to myself, I'm such an idiot. Of course, I charged for the work, but it could have been a lot easier with my lift and everything, instead of having to load that entire axle assembly into a 280 SE in the guy's garage. So, learn from my mistakes, right? Now we're going to go into air suspension. So unless you have a receipt for air suspension valves, preferably from Martin Werminghausen at 600 Air Suspension, because he's my favorite, you're probably going to need to do air suspension valves. And if the bags have really deep cracks in them, like you can see cords in the bags, you're probably going to have to replace airbags too. This is all 109 cars. Now, some people ask me, well, can't I just convert my W109 to springs? No, if you feel that you're in a situation where it's cost prohibitive to, fix your 109 the right way, sell it. You don't get, if you can't afford it, don't play with it. You don't deserve to own it. Sorry. And this is coming from somebody who has who used to have a 6.3 and would make some stupid sacrifices to be able to keep the 6.3 going, which ultimately I eschewed it for a 67-300 SEL, which was a decision that I felt much more comfortable with. But the biggest problem with the air suspension systems is the fact that the air valves wear out and they start to leak down. Does this mean they're unreliable? No. But if you think that the air suspension car you're looking at is a really good car and the owner says, oh, it holds air for a week, everything works great. No, they should hold air ad infinitum. They should not lose any air pressure. The light can be on, but the height should not come down. They really should not be losing height. So, if you're looking at a 108 or a 109 car, or if you've got a penchant for W112s or a W100, you never know who's watching. The air suspension valves need to hold air pressure. And again, this shouldn't be a deal breaker, but it should be a negotiating factor. And that's what all of these are. They shouldn't make you walk away from the car. They should make you negotiate harder and buy more prudently. These are questions you should ask before you hit the bid button on BAT or you send the dealer a deposit without looking the car over. Okay, now that we've talked about air suspension and axles and rubber suspension parts that fail, let's talk a little bit about HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, so that those of you who would like to have a more thorough understanding of the HVAC system in this car know what to look for. So these cars had, for the most part, an AC system that was not fully integrated, and that's where I'm going to begin, because most people who want these cars want to know that in the summer when they're using them, their AC is going to work. So almost all of these cars, except the 3.5 and 4.5 liter cars, had their AC driven by a York twin piston compressor. And a lot of people say, oh, the York is so awful, let's replace it with a Sandin. I know that at Star Motors, their long-standing policy was put a Sandin rotary compressor in place of the York compressor. Just get that clunky old thing out of there. Well, they're wrong. As usual, the Mercedes engineers at the time were a little bit ahead of the ball. They still kind of are. Now, why am I making a case for a power sapping 50-year-old AC compressor design that everybody else craps on in the industry? And it's for one reason, because it is good capacity and it makes good cold air and it's dead reliable. And so your compressors work best with R12 or an R12 substitute, such as EnviroSafe or Freeze 12. Their biggest virtue is that for $80, you can go on eBay and buy all the parts to reseal them. Their bearings rarely go bad. Anne Marie, do you think you could pull up a picture of a York AC compressor?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. They tend to be mechanically robust, and although they do cause some vibrations and they're not great for super high RPMs, they do their job incredibly well. Most of my customers who have these cars with York AC compressors have told me that they are impressed by how well these 50-year-old AC systems cool. So if you're not getting cold air and you do have a functional York compressor, what else could be going wrong? Well, the number one problem that goes wrong with these cars is the expansion valves get blocked. And apart from early, 65, 66, and some early 67 model year cars, almost all of these cars have expansion valves that live inside the evaporator case. So the evaporator is not terribly hard to pull on these, but it's located in the right passenger compartment under the dash. And you have to pull it out, which could be, there can be a little bit of pain involved, but you have to pull it out to be able to replace the capillary tube type expansion valve if you can't flush it out. Sometimes dryers will collapse internally, especially the bare dryers. um, that were used on like the front mounted dryers right on the condensers, but some dryers are extremely good, like the old aluminum dryers. Oh, here we go. Okay. So this is a real York compressor, and this is about what you're going to find in like a 280 SE or similar car. And if you look at the top where the service valves are, these are the types of service valves that I like because they screw on. There was another version of the York where the service valves bolted onto the top of the compressor. And these types of Yorks that have service valves that bolt directly on with like 2 half-inch bolts, these are the ones that are most prone to leakage when they sit, whereas the type that have what are called rotolock service valves that bolt onto the top with the roughly 30 millimeter screw-on fitting, those are the better compressors because once they're sealed, they stay sealed. You don't have to go back every 8 months and find that you're low on Freon or something like that. So let's, anyway, so with the York compressors, I guess their biggest advantage is that when you're driving and it's 95 to 97 degrees outside, a York with R12 or an R12 substitute is going to keep making cold air, whereas a Sandin starts to give up at around 90 degrees. When it gets to about 90 or 91 degrees and 100% humidity, you might as well, I'm not saying you might as well shut your AC off, but you're going to develop this impression if you've switched to a Sandin compressor that the AC just doesn't perform. And here in Florida, people are extremely pushy about me getting their AC right. So I've had to learn all of this through attrition. Now, going back to the internals of the HVAC system, the rest of the system is pretty robust. You don't get a lot of hose failures. I mean, if you have original hoses in your car, keep them until they're proven bad. We've had a bunch of these cars come into our shop with original AC hoses, and the owners think, oh, I got to replace the AC hoses. No, they're very tough. Eaton or Parker or whoever made these hoses back in the day in the 60s and 70s, they built a hose that lasts a lifetime as opposed to these like cheap, thin aluminum fitting things you get from your, local cold air distributors or whatever. Now, inside the car, you've got heater levers that are prone to breaking off. And this is a really painful job. And I know that George Murphy and Miller's and some other places sell a Duralever kit where you could replace your lever with a hard plastic lever. Also on Euro market cars, they used a harder heater lever. If you can find harder version heater levers and install those, that's my first choice. The Duralevers are a good option. The rubber handled levers are okay, but it's a good idea to replace your heater valve O-rings, which are behind the glove box and also not fun to get to. Usually if the heater core has been blocked off, that's why, but nothing on this job pales in difficulty. Pales, am I using the right word? Maybe I should use the word compares. Nothing, no job in the HVAC system compares to the difficulty of replacing a heater fan, because the heater fan on these cars is buried between the dashboard and the heater box. And according to Aaron Householder, who's a good friend of mine who's done a bunch of these jobs, when you get good at it, it's like a 22-hour job. So again, not a deal breaker, but a great place to negotiate, because if you can live without a heater fan, so be it. But some of you who are in cooler climates who really need a heater fan, some of you who really need a heater fan should know this. Now, the AC fans are super robust and really easy to get to. They're right in the passenger floor. 5 minutes, AC fan out, and they're both fans are actually rebuildable too, which is nice. Now, let's go into some other areas that people usually don't touch on with these cars when we're when people are trying to buy them. So I'm sure some of you want to talk about engines and transmissions, which is a very important thing to look out for. We're going to go through the weak points of the 6-cylinder, 8-cylinder, and M100 8-cylinder engine. So starting with the 2.5 and 2.8 liter M108 and M130.92 carbureted engines, we find that the biggest weaknesses with these engines are premature wear to cylinders and valves and carburation issues. Usually with the carburetors, if you saw my Zenith 3540 presentation, they're actually very good carburetors. I know that there's some idiots out there who've installed Webers or Holleys or whatever. I don't personally find that the cars run very well with Webers. They run, but they do not run well. They don't run as intended. Also, they get horrible gas mileage. Also, so much gas gets in the oil that you're eventually going to ruin your bottom end bearings. So a Weber is the fastest, cheapest way to an engine rebuild. We can say that, I think, with great certainty. Probably the smartest thing you could do is, if you can't handle your own carb rebuild, and a lot of people think they can, but they can't, farm out your carburetor rebuild to somebody who knows what they're doing. I like using Omar Rodriguez, but there's some other people who can do this job as well. You know, I know my friend Jamie Kopczynski is very good at it. Jamie might be watching. I know there's some people out on the West Coast like Bob Gunthorpe who are very good at it too. You know, it's just a matter of finding somebody who understands those carburetors. And sometimes you have to make parts for them too. So you may also want to talk to somebody who has the ability to CAD CAM engineer things like a diaphragm or a float ventilation valve. As far as the engines go, worn valve guides are the #1 thing we see, usually characterized by profuse blue smoke and somewhat high oil consumption. That means the head comes off, and that affects all of the engines from this era. We usually replace them with hardened silicon bronze guides, and silicon bronze guides should be installed at room temperature with the head at room temperature. No freezing and heating, none of that stuff. They have to be installed at room temp, and they need to be installed by somebody who knows what they're doing. We also see a lot of worn out valves. So if you need valve guides, plan on replacing your valves too. This can get expensive on M100 engines, but in general, in the 6-cylinder engines, it's not too bad. You'll spend about $600 in a set of valves, stem seals, and guides. And then the machine work is usually about $800 to $1,200, depending on who you use. Now, removing and installing the head is a different story. If you're good at it, it's like 3 hours off and 6 hours on a carbureted car. On a fuel injected car, there's more time involved, especially if you're detailing the engine. But try to be wary of cars that have valve needs. Now, bottom ends are a different story. You want to do a compression test on these cars if you have any suspicion about the health of the engine. I'm not saying you have to do it all the time, but you should do a compression test. What you're looking for with compression tests are consistency, and who's ever doing the test needs to do it with a strong battery and the valves adjusted, and they need to know what the heck they're doing. You can't do a good compression test with a weak battery. Here's a good example. We had a 69 280S come into our shop that was overheated severely. It was so severely overheated that it ran poorly and it had lost a valve guide and it was smoking like crazy. But I said we should compression test this thing just to make sure. Well, the shop that had worked on it before, because people only send their cars to me now, I guess, when they're desperate. But the shop that had looked at it before said that all the cylinders were toasted and had weak compression. I said, that doesn't make any sense. So I pulled compression readings in all the cylinders with a weak battery, and of course they were low. Then I put a good battery in the car, and I had compression numbers hitting at 140 to 155 PSI, which was fine. Considering the issues with the valves, that was very good compression. So we pulled the head, rebuilt the head, put the whole thing back together. Car ran great. So again, don't necessarily write off a car because you think it might have low compression or because somebody did a compression test on it and they were so-so about it. Collect the data for your itself, you should probably be there when it's being done if possible, or at least FaceTime or something with the mechanic. I mean, we could do virtual inspections now. We're in the 21st century. The uh, uh, the other thing about the bottom ends of these engines is that they have very poor tolerance for bad machine work. So if they said, "Oh, the engine's rebuilt," and you as the buyer go, "Oh, it's got a rebuilt engine. This is going to be great." Sorry, doesn't work that way either. You have to vet the person who rebuilt the engine, because you have to ask 3 questions if the engine rebuilds. Why was it rebuilt? Who rebuilt it? And uh, uh, who rebuilt it, and what parts did they replace? Typically, when you do an engine rebuild the right way on these cars, pistons and either boring the cylinder first oversize, second oversize, maybe sleeving the engine, you're going to have to do some of that stuff. Now, sleeving on these motors is generally not the best option, because according to my machinist, Jim Dean, it weakens the block. But some engines do have to be sleeved. So if the engine was sleeved, the person really needs to know what they were doing. Now, some engines have factory sleeves, but not any of these engines. So, this is just something to keep in mind. Now, going to the V8 cars, the 3.5 and 4.5 have super tough bottom ends. They rarely wear out. I know when I bought my 280 SE 4.5 and the nose of the crankshaft failed where the woodruff key that holds the crank gear goes on had stripped out. I took my original pistons and rings out. We measured everything. The original pistons were good. We put new rings in and we were good to go. And the thing had 180 PSI of compression. I mean, it was just literally, it was amazing. Same goes for the 6.3. 6.3s, from what I understand, when they sit, they do suffer from ring fractures. Now, the question now is, what do you do if you need pistons made? Well, Mercedes does have a lot of pistons. There are a lot of new old stock piston sets on eBay. But if you can't get a piston, you go to a company called Wahl Special Kolben in Fellbach, Germany. That's WAHL Wahl Special Kolben. And they make pistons for Mercedes Classic. So you know that they're good. And I've had Wahl make pistons for me before, and they were wonderful. They were like little jewels, engineered works of art. I can't say anything better about them, and all for 2,000 euros for 8 oversized pistons for an M117 engine. What more could one ask for? So that's what you do if you need pistons. But again, bottom end issues, camshaft wear issues. Always pull the valve covers in these engines. Check for worn cam lobes. Cams can be expensive. Thank you, Anne Marie. It's like you read my mind. I have become so frustrated with the fact that people don't adjust valves on these engines. So you see valve wear, rocker wear, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody looks at these things, and if you're really paying the big bucks for a car, it's a good idea to vet the condition of the camshafts. On the V8 cars, always look at the right cam. It wears out first. Also on the V8 cars, look at the timing chains because they tend to wear out. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about a special problem that all of the aluminum heads have, but this is particularly bad in the 6.3. So it can affect any of the gas Mercedes engines, but it seems to affect the 6.3 in a disproportionately high number. Where the fire ring in the head gasket seals to the cylinder head, there's also a coolant passage, and coolant corrosion occurs between the fire ring and the surface of the cylinder head and eventually intrudes into the cylinder. What does this cause? It causes coolant consumption without the symptoms of a blown head gasket. So you'll end up using coolant, wondering where it went, finding coolant vapors and coolant sludge in your breather. But engine doesn't run hot. You might get some pinging, which is a good sign that there's an issue. But again, engine doesn't run hot. You're like, what's going on? You don't get excessive pressure in the radiator. You keep asking yourself this question. Then finally, the answer comes to you. You're like, must be burning coolant. And that's what 6.3s do. So when you get the 6.3 heads off and you find that there's coolant corrosion on the surface of the cylinder head where the fire ring is, you have to get the heads deck welded. And again, you need a knowledgeable machinist. And you should also do valves and guides then too, especially because that cylinder is going to get a little bit beat up. I'm toying with the idea after our baby is born in the middle of February, when things normalize again, doing a workshop called All You Need to Know About M100 Engines. I think that would help dispel some of the myths surrounding the M100 engine. It may have to be a two-part workshop, but you know, I get so many requests for information about these engines that I think it would be fun. But this is something to be aware of. So the 6.3, how do you detect this issue? You pull all the plugs, you pressure test the cooling system, and you sit there and wait and look for a pressure drop. And if you see a pressure drop, make sure the radiator's full and wait for coolant to start coming out of one of the spark plug holes. Hint, it's usually on cylinder 4 and cylinder 8, which are the two rear cylinders, but it can affect any cylinder. Okay, so I should talk briefly about body corrosion, and then we're going to talk about interiors, and we're going to talk about value. So body corrosion. Always check rockers for Bondo, especially inner rockers. The more time you spend crawling around under the car, the better. These are the areas we see rust out on 108s that should be checked with more than just you know, a magnet, maybe a screwdriver. The front bumper support, replacement of this bumper support can cost up to $8,000 parts and labor with a knowledgeable shop that is a spot welder. So somebody doing it right. You've got to actually pull the front fenders off to do this job. So it's quite a job. And there's a lot of spot welding involved. Number 2, the inner rockers and outer rockers towards the front. So you have to get the car in a lift and look at the inner rockers and make sure that if they are rusted, it's a tightly contained area towards the front. What you don't want are inner rockers that are rusted all the way down, because that can be a bit of a deal breaker. You especially want to make sure that this was not concealed. Number 3, what are called the dog legs that run inboard of the rear wheels. These are like a structural rail that runs directly inboard of each rear wheel. They can rust out. And in order to replace them right, sometimes you have to pull the entire back axle. Number 4, cars that have sunroofs, you want to check for sunroof pan rust, rust inside the roof. That can be a real pain. And then, of course, number 5, try to make sure that you don't have a rusty firewall. So where the grills are, those pretty chrome grills where the heater and air intake is, you want to make sure that you don't have rust lurking in that compartment. That can be a real detriment if you have a rusty firewall, because there's a lot of work involved there. Anything else is generally pretty easy to deal with if you have the right body shop. As far as interiors go, original is always better. I know we don't have original on every car now, but original is always best. I think that some of the replacement leather from like 10, 15 years ago really did not feel right. It looks like a cheap Michael Kors handbag. Fortunately, the leather industry is improving, so you have better leather coming from German auto tops, from Heide's leather, from suppliers in Germany, from Arista, leather that's actually surface dyed, thick hide, vegetable dye-based leather that's actually the right stuff, instead of the stuff that, you know, looks okay, kind of the pattern looks okay, but you start looking at the leather up close and you're like, wait a second, this feels really cheap and synthetic. And that's really the beauty of an original interior. I was going to say, if you have an original interior, preserve it at all costs. You know, don't say, oh, I have a tear in this thing. Oh, I've got to redo my whole interior. Oh, my driver's seat's going. Got to redo my whole interior. No, don't do that. Don't be one of those people. The MB Tex interiors are super hard wearing. Sometimes the palm fiber pads inside wear out. You can get these pads either from Mercedes or GAHH, and the GAHH ones are okay. You just need a knowledgeable interior shop to put them in, because sometimes they have to be shaved a little bit. But MB Tex is super durable and also relatively easy to replicate. So, the MB Tex is kind of a blessing because of its durability. Some other difficult jobs that you should be cognizant of when buying one of these cars: headliners, front and rear window gaskets. Door seals, while not difficult, cost about $1,600 a set. Of course, you want to make sure that if you have a 3.5 and 4.5 liter car, the D-Jetronic injection system is working well. We did a whole talk on D-Jetronic injection a few months ago. So if you want to, you can go to our events and member resources page to check it out. Now we're going to talk about values. So a lot of the items I gave you are negotiation points. They're not deal breakers per se. I always tell people, try to focus on a car with a sound engine, a nice body, a nice interior, a decent transmission, no weird rear axle noises. Try to find a nice original car. But there are cars you should run away from and cars you shouldn't run away from. So 108s typically present in 3 different states. Really well-kept original cars, kind of like worn-in or tatty drivers, and 3 cars that I like to call sleeping beauties because they've been parked for 20 or 30 years and haven't really seen the light of day or good care, And so in this category, the cars that I tend to favor the most are sleeping beauties. Really, a car can only go through the sleeping beauty stage once or twice. And the whole thing about these sleeping beauties is that they represent a good opportunity for people that are very hands-on and dedicated to learning about the car to buy a car like this at the right price, to work through its issues and end up with a very well-sorted final product. Now, the really nice original cars, or sometimes cars that have had like a cosmetic restoration, like they've had paint, maybe they've had some interior work. A lot of the time, but not always, those cars tend to be priced towards the top of the market, especially when they're in the hands of dealers. Now, I'm not going to come on here and crap all over the idea of buying a car from a dealer, but I am going to come on here and crap all over the idea of buying a car from a BAT auction. I think it's a horrible idea, especially when you're dealing with the W108 or 109, because there's so many layers of complexity and detail to these cars. So I don't recommend being under the gun when you purchase one. There are a lot of these cars, they're tough cars and the robust cars. You don't need to go on Hemmings or BAT or whatever and buy a car because it presents as a nice car. You really should vet the car carefully. And that goes with, say, whether you're buying a nice original car from a private owner or an individual. Now, these cars are going to need some things. Even the best car where people always go to me, and I get so sick of hearing, I don't want a project. Pierre, I don't want a project. I'm like, what can I tell you? Even the best car in the world is going to need some stuff. They're going to keep needing stuff. They're cars, they break. You have to roll up your sleeves and deal with it. I personally have never seen a 108 or a 109 car that didn't need at least $3,500 worth of work. And it's mostly because parts of the cars are expensive and because labor is intensive. Now some of this stuff is optional. Some of it you could put off and do now, and some you could do later. But at the end of the day, you have to accept the fact that when you're buying a Mercedes from this year, they are labor intensive. I don't like to buy super tired drivers unless the price is right. So this is where you roll up. You roll up your sleeves when you're dealing with one of these cars, because usually the sellers may be a little bit pie in the sky, whether they're used car salesmen or individuals in Facebook Marketplace. This is where you take the knowledge you've learned in this presentation and you bring negotiating power to the table by saying, well, your front subframe mounts are bad. Your rear axle mounts are bad. The car needs door seals. Here's the list of things I have to do. Let's get off that $12,000 asking price and see if we can make a deal at 6,000 or 7,000. And I think that part of the reason these cars have gone up in value so steeply is because there has been a hole or a gap in this knowledge that I'm presenting with Mercedes shops, where people assume just because the car runs and drives and it looks good that it's worth 20 grand, and that shouldn't necessarily be the case. So again, you want to watch out for sort of like the tatty tired drivers that need sorting. You don't want to overpay for these cars, and a lot of the time these cars are brought up on the internet, and their photos are photoshopped and their presentation is tarted up to sound like ad copy to make it seem like they're better cars than they actually are. And you really don't want to overpay for those cars. So one of the things that I get so frustrated with when people look at these cars is they go for the easiest, most visible car. They don't want to do any work when they're hunting for the right car. And when you're hunting for one of these cars, you need to talk to private sellers and mechanics and people who might know somebody, because buying like the easiest car to purchase, or acquiring a car just because it's low-hanging fruit and you see one and you think, oh, I've always wanted one of these, it's only 20 grand, I could break into that 401k and get my dream car. I don't necessarily know if that's the best idea. And I'd say never be in a rush to buy one of these things. Now, let's look at values. 6-cylinder cars, 250Ss and SEs. I would say try to avoid paying over $15,000 for even the nicest 250S or SE. Most of the time, these are like $5,000-$6,000 cars for like a running driving car that needs some work. Maybe $5,500 for like a nice sleeping beauty. When you get to the 280S and SE, again, about the same price range for a nice driver, 5-6 grand. They're a little bit more common, so maybe even a slightly lower price. The best cars out there, like a nice 71 with a sunroof, unless it's some weird low mileage time capsule, I'd try to avoid paying 20. I'd try to get, 15, 16, 17, when you maybe 18 for an extremely well sorted car with one owner history and zero rust and like under 100,000 miles. But mileage is really not that important of a category. Now, when you get into the air suspension cars, because the cost of maintenance is higher, you're going to find that the project cars sell for less money and the fully sorted cars sell for more money. So there's going to be a bigger financial gap. So with air suspension cars, figure like, 10 to 15 for a decent driver, 300 SEL, 6-cylinder, 3.5 or 4.5 to up to, 40 grand for a very nice 300 SEL 4.5 and maybe $5,000 for a solid project car with a little bit of rust that hasn't run in a few years, or a decade or so. 6.3s tend to have their own market. So with 6.3s, I say don't overpay for a car with a bunch of needs, but it's okay to overpay a little bit for a car that doesn't have any needs, as long as the repairs in the car document. There are a lot of shops out there, believe it or not, that have customers with these cars that are like established Mercedes repair shops like Morris Motors in Walnut Creek, California, or another good example would probably be Larry DeGive or Bud Cloniger's shop, MB Motors in Phoenix, Arizona. Usually shop owners like this know at least one person with a nice 6.3. So with those cars, it's more about the car rather than the price. But I'd say like a 6.3 that needs some work is 40 to 60,000, and one that doesn't, well, it just sort of goes up from there, into the 70s and 80s for the right car. Um, I don't I don't think that there's anything I haven't covered, but in case, oh yeah, Walnut Grove, not Walnut Creek. I'm sorry. Morris Motors is in Walnut Grove. I think I've covered most of the areas that people don't discuss openly. I mean, you should be looking at things like dash pads, right? They're right there in front of you. But what I would probably say is that these cars tend to be a little overvalued in the market, so you might have to fight hard with a reasonable seller to get the right one at a fair price. If there are any areas that I have not covered adequately, I will now take questions to cover those areas. So Anne-Marie, let's let the questions roll.
Okay, our first question is from Ernie, and as we go through these, if there are any other questions, anybody can put them into the chat, either to everyone or to me directly, and I will add them to our list. So the first one is from Ernie. What angle should the split be mounted at regarding the rear axle?
The split should be mounted at, it should be facing the side pointing towards the back of the car. So the idea with the split was that it was supposed to be done in the area where it would be easiest to install, and you get the best window when it is facing you directly. There's going to be, if you're installing any axle boot, there's going to be a script on part of the boot at each end, that on one end, that says Oben, O-B-E-N, and that's German for top, and that should always face upward, and that will orient the split. If you're looking at it sort of like a clock, that'll orient the split at about 3 o'clock or so. Next question.
The next question we have is from John. He says, I'm reading that putting a 108, 109, 110, 111, or 112 on a two-post lift will allow the subframe to hang, and with the weight of the engine and transmission, it will tear the mounts. For this reason, do you recommend not to put these cars on a two-post lift?
This is a very funny question, and John, I'm glad you asked. Actually, if they're going to tear, let them tear, because it means they are weak. So if the subframe mounts are in good shape, they should not tear. They should be fine. If they're weak, this is actually how you inspect subframe mounts. You put the car in a two-post lift. The chances are they didn't tear from going in the lift. They tore from being old, and they were probably torn before they went on the lift. So time for subframe mounts. Okay, next question.
Next question is from Gary. Any hints on freeing up a distributor? My 6.3 distributor won't move.
Wow. So the question is, how did that happen? I've never heard of that happening before. Well, you need to determine whether it seized from sitting on a shelf in a humid environment, or whether it's seized from a mechanical failure. So if it's seized from a mechanical failure, you really need to find a good machine shop with a distributor machine. If it's seized,
I should have been more specific when I asked that. The car runs, but I can't time it because I can't rotate the distributor to time it.
Really? I see. So your distributor is stuck in the housing. Are you loosening the 5mm Allen bolt? Is that what you're referring to? When you loosen that bolt, you can't rotate the distributor?
Yes.
Well, how have you tried to remove the distributor? Have you used like a brass hammer to try to knock it upwards out of its hole?
No, I haven't done that. I've just tried to knock it in a way that it would turn, and it won't do that.
Yeah, I've run into this problem before. So you have a couple of options. I think the best option that you have, if you remove the entire 5mm bolt, the distributor and its gear fit into a housing on the front of the engine. Your worst case scenario is that you'll have to remove that housing with the distributor. But probably your best case scenario here, I'm thinking what probably happened is somebody found an O-ring that they thought was the right size and it ended up being too big and they forced the distributor in anyway. Your best bet, because these are cast iron distributors, is to go from the bottom with like a long 2x4 and anchor it, seat it firmly at the base of the distributor, and use a brass hammer to try to drive the distributor upwards. Now, the good news about these distributors is they have a little two-legged gear on the bottom, and you can't lose the timing orientation if you do it this way. So that's probably your best bet, but that's really the only advice that I can offer you. I've run into stuck distributors in 189 engines before, which is a lot worse, but in this case, you're going to have to resort to some sort of force from below, well applied directly and accurately applied force from below to drive the distributor out of its housing.
Okay, thank you.
Good luck. You're going to need it. All right, next question.
Our next question is from Rick. His mechanic recommends that he install rear axle gears from a 3.5 or a 4.5 car into his 1970 280 SE 6-cylinder. Is this a common upgrade?
Yeah, Rick, actually it is. It's a good upgrade too. I like doing it a lot. So the 3.5 liter cars had a 3.69 ring and pinion, and the 4.5 had a 3.27 ring and pinion. And the thing about these rings and pinions in your 1970 280 SE is that the pinion gear is not going to be an exact fit. You actually have to machine out part of the differential case to get the pinion gear to fit. And when you're done, you're going to have to recalibrate the speedometer. But if you live in an area that's not like extremely mountainous and you have lots of flat roads for cruising, the 369 or 327 differential provides useful lower RPMs, a meaningful increase in fuel economy, and less engine wear and tear. And so I personally do recommend that upgrade. If you're buying just the parts from Mercedes, a 327 ring and pinion is about, with like your wholesale discount, because you're an MBCA member at Classic, it should be about $2,100, but you're going to have a lot of other parts. And labor usually borders on the 40-hour mark. But personally, I think it's worth it. And if you could find used parts, all the better, although the supply of used parts is pretty sparse. So keep that in mind.
Thanks a lot. Good advice.
You're welcome.
Next question is from Ernie. He wants to know a little bit more about glass separation.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a real problem, Ernie, especially on the East Coast. Well, one of the problems that we see a lot with these cars is that when on the front and rear windshields, the outer and inner pane were two separate pieces that were sort of glued together. And when moisture gets into the corners where the two panes are glued together, it starts to separate the inner pane from the outer pane. This usually happens because windshield seals deteriorate and start letting water in. And this particularly happens in the corners. Now, is this a good reason to get rid of an original windshield? Absolutely not. But it is a good reason to make sure that your windshields are actually sealing in the corners and maybe change a window gasket. So, something to think about. All right, next question.
Our next question is actually our last question. It's from Ernest. He wants to know where you can find the footwell light for his 280 SEL 4.5.
Yeah, so those footwell lights are, you're probably not going to necessarily find one in the United States. I'd probably look with Niemöller in Germany, Niemoeller. They seem to have just about everything, and they have some very nice additive packages that you can some really nice parts that are not available from Mercedes anymore that you could purchase. But there seem to be more and more reproduction parts popping up. So Authentic Classics may have this too, but I think that Niemöller is probably your best bet, and you may even have to call them and inquire about it. So keep in mind they're in Germany, so there's like a time difference. Niemöller is usually where I go to all of my hard to find items, whether they are battery cables or wiring harnesses or chrome trim parts that are in LA. So I would try them first. Okay, I think we had a question about fuel additives.
Yes. Do you recommend using any kind of fuel additives to the 6.3 octane boost, Marvel Mystery Oil?
Yeah, actually, I do, and this goes for all mechanically injected cars. I like to use Marvel Mystery Oil or a 1% mixture of 2-cycle oil in all of the mechanically fuel injected cars to lubricate the injection pump and the injection nozzles. On the carbureted cars, it's critical, if possible, that you either use ethanol-free fuel or an anti-ethanol additive. The anti-ethanol additive is not as effective as ethanol-free gas, but I know in some states that are, regulated by idiots like Gavin Newsom, you get no choice about what kind of fuel you're using, and basically what happens is ethanol over time does rot the gaskets in the carburetor, so you want to use something to protect them. But increasing the fuel lubricity on mechanically injected engines is extremely important, and you shouldn't neglect it at all. So there you go. Do we have another real question? I see the chat is buzzing with interesting comments, but I want to see where the questions are.
Mario wants to know if you should buy a 108 now.
Mario has my email address. I'm sure we can work it out over a couple of emails.
And then Ron would like to know, how often do drive shaft center carrier bearings go bad, and are they hard to replace?
Not very, and they're not super hard. I mean, it's more hard work than technical skill, but what does go bad is the drive shaft support bushing, which is a giant rubber donut. They do develop some extra play. And this bushing can occasionally collapse, leading to some drive shaft vibration that might be a little hard to detect, but it's still an issue. So you should always look at the front flex disc and this rubber boot. As far as drive shaft carrier bearings go in these cars, though, I only usually replace them if the boot has an excessive amount of play, but I rarely run into an outright failure with the carrier bearings.
That is all the questions that we have.
All right, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to do one more Q&A. That's going to be a live event on YouTube concerning technical questions and questions that are on people's minds when they're shopping for a particular Mercedes. And then after that particular event, I'm going to go radio silent for a few months because my wife and I are expecting a baby sometime in the middle of February. So I will be available via email for those of you that need to contact me, but I can't promise when the responses are going to come. And again, this is going to start sometime in the middle of February when our baby gets here. But I'm very pleased to see I saw 70 people or more on this chat, and some of you are people that I know own these cars, and some of you are people that might be looking. The thing that I want to emphasize before I go is that we're basically, the last bastion of hope for these cars. If we don't buy them, preserve them, and restore them, they're going to end up turning into 5-minute YouTube videos on Hoonigan, where some idiot has LS swapped a 280 SE because he thought he was cool. And you get in a car like that, it runs and drives like garbage, nothing like the Mercedes engineers intended. So really, as the MBCA, we have to make a concerted effort to preserve these cars. And for those of you that are doing it, whether it's a 108 or a 116 or a 123 or 107 or whatever, I really am pleased about all of this. And I think that this is a good sign that there's a lot of interest in our club for classic cars. So remember, if you have any comments, you can email them to what's our address, our email address for the social media committee? It's MBCA.
Our email for the social media committee is socialmedia@mbca.org, and that goes to the chairman of our committee, Andrew, who will forward it on to the person who needs to see it. So we welcome your comments, suggestions, volunteers who would like to present a future class. We would definitely like to hear from you, especially since we will be losing Pierre for a little while.
Yes, I would really love for somebody to at least temporarily step up to the plate and fill my shoes. So if you guys have undertaken some big projects in your own classic Mercedes, that's the kind of information that we would love to see here. Anyway, good night, everybody. Happy New Year. And we'll announce one more presentation that will be on a weekend sometime. I think it's going to be the last weekend of January. So I look forward to seeing some of you there. Okay. Have a good night, and thank you, Anne Marie.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us
Thanks,
for
everyone.
tonight's presentation. If you want to see our upcoming schedule, it's mbca.org/upcoming-smc-events. And this live stream, along with our prior live streams, are all on our YouTube channel. I put the link in the chat, but if you would like to search it on YouTube, it's mbca/events and member resources. All of our prior live streams are on there. And again, if you want to contact us, our email is socialmedia@mbca.org. Thank you so very much for joining us